The crystal chandeliers of Le Chateau Blanc cast dancing shadows across pristine white tablecloths as Margaret Worthington swept through the entrance, her Hermes handbag catching the light with every calculated step. She had perfected the art of making an entrance over her 53 years, and tonight would be no different. But what happened in the next 40 minutes would shake the very foundation of everything she believed about herself, about worth, and about the invisible people she had spent a lifetime looking past. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because the waiter's response will absolutely floor you, and if you believe in the power of humility and human dignity, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you'll want to hear every word of what happens next. Margaret had specifically chosen this restaurant for her daughter Vivian's engagement celebration because it was, as she told anyone who would listen, the kind of establishment that separated those who belonged from those who merely aspired. The reservation had been made weeks in advance, and she had triple-checked that they would be seated in the main dining room, not tucked away in some corner where the less distinguished patrons were placed. Her son-in-law-to-be, Preston Blackwell III, came from old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself but somehow always made its presence known, and Margaret was determined that every detail of this evening would reflect the elevated status their families shared. As the hostess guided them to their table, Margaret's practiced eye swept across the room, mentally cataloguing the other diners, assessing their worth by the cut of their clothes and the subtlety of their jewelry. She had built a career in real estate development, climbing ruthlessly from a modest middle-class background to the penthouse suite of success, and she wore her achievements like armor. But somewhere along that climb, she had developed a habit that her own mother would have found shameful. She had begun to measure human worth by bank account balances and zip codes, by brand names and business cards. Their waiter approached the table with a professional smile, notepad in hand. Margaret noticed immediately that he was older than the typical waitstaff, perhaps in his early 40s, with slight creases around his eyes that spoke of either laughter or worry, she couldn't tell which. His name tag read Daniel, and there was something careful about the way he moved, as though he were carrying something fragile inside himself that might break if he wasn't cautious. "Good evening, and welcome to Le Chateau Blanc," Daniel said, his voice warm and genuine. "My name is Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you off with something to drink, or would you like a moment to look over our wine list?" Margaret barely glanced at him, already flipping through the leather-bound wine menu with the air of someone conducting a business transaction rather than beginning a celebration. Her daughter Vivian looked slightly uncomfortable, as she often did when her mother was in full performance mode, but Preston seemed oblivious, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone who had grown up in restaurants like this and found them utterly unremarkable. "We'll have the Chateau Margaux 2010, Margaret announced, purposely using her carefully cultivated French pronunciation, drawing out the vowels in a way that was meant to demonstrate sophistication. She had spent thousands on language courses and European vacations, not because she loved French culture, but because fluency was another badge of status she could wear. Daniel nodded politely and noted it down. "An excellent choice, ma'am. That's one of our finest Bordeaux selections. I'll have the sommelier bring it right out." Something about his easy acceptance irritated Margaret. She had expected him to be impressed, perhaps even slightly intimidated by her selection of a wine that cost more than most people earned in a week. Instead, he had simply acknowledged it and moved on, as though expensive wine was merely wine, regardless of its price tag. She felt a small, sharp need to establish the hierarchy of this interaction, to make it clear who was in control. As the evening progressed and the sommelier presented the wine, Daniel took their appetizer orders with the same calm professionalism. Margaret's irritation grew incrementally with each interaction. There was something about his composure, his refusal to show deference beyond basic courtesy, that rankled her. She was accustomed to seeing anxiety in service workers when she arrived, a recognition that they were serving someone important, someone who could make or break their evening with a tip or a complaint to management. When Daniel returned to take their main course orders, Margaret saw her opportunity. She had been studying the menu, and she knew exactly how she would demonstrate her superiority, how she would put this waiter in his place and perhaps teach her future son-in-law how to properly manage those in service positions. Je voudrais le canard rôti avec une sauce à l'orange, mais je veux que la sauce soit servie à côté, pas sur le canard, Margaret announced loudly, clearly, each word in French designed to showcase her linguistic abilities. She wanted the roasted duck with orange sauce, but she wanted the sauce on the side, not on the duck. She continued, her voice rising slightly so that nearby tables could hear, Et assurez-vous que les légumes soient cuits al dente, pas trop cuits comme vous, les Américains, avez tendance à le faire. Make sure the vegetables are cooked al dente, not overcooked as you Americans tend to do them. The insult was deliberate, casual, delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Vivian's face flushed crimson. Mother, she said quietly, urgently, but Margaret waved her off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. I'm simply ensuring we get proper service, darling, Margaret said in English, her tone suggesting that her daughter's embarrassment was proof of her own sophistication. When one is paying these prices, one should receive European-level quality. Daniel stood perfectly still for a moment, his pen poised above his notepad, and something flickered across his face, gone almost before it appeared. Then he smiled, a different kind of smile than before, one that held something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Certainement, madame, he replied, his French accent absolutely perfect, not the studied pronunciation of a language student but the fluid, natural intonation of a native speaker. Ce sera fait exactement comme vous le souhaitez. Etsij pousse me permettre, votre accent est tout à fait charmant. Il me rappelle les efforts admirables de ma grand-mère américaine lorsqu'elle tentait de parler avec nos voisins à Lyon. Certainly, ma'am. It will be done exactly as you wish. And if I may say, your accent is quite charming. It reminds me of my American grandmother's admirable efforts when she tried to speak with our neighbors in Lyon. The compliment was delivered with such genuine warmth that it took Margaret a moment to process the implied message. He had recognized her accent as imperfect, as studied rather than native, and he had compared her to someone learning a second language rather than mastering one. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, still in flawless French, addressing the entire table. Pour vous, mademoiselle, he asked Vivian, who stared at him with wide eyes, clearly relieved that someone had gently deflated her mother's performance without being overtly rude. Vivian ordered in English, her voice small and apologetic. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation that she immediately recognized as humiliation. She had been bested, and worse, she had been bested kindly, with grace, which somehow made it more mortifying than if he had been sharp or cutting in return. Preston looked up from his phone for the first time that evening, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, and Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that she had just demonstrated weakness in front of the very people she had been trying to impress. As Daniel walked away to submit their orders, Margaret found herself unable to let it go. The itch of wounded pride demanded scratching, and she had spent too many years building her persona to allow a waiter, of all people, to undermine it. When he returned with their appetizers, she was ready with another volley, determined to regain the upper hand. "Your French is quite good," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I suppose you studied it in school community college." Perhaps she emphasized the last two words, making it clear that she considered such an education inferior, barely worth acknowledging.